Page 197. Our story today is called Music in Your Heart. This is a realistic fiction by Eileen M. Berry. A realistic fiction, just to refresh your memory, is a story that is not true. It is made up, but it could be real. So again, that is a realistic fiction. It is illustrated by Gary Undercuffler. I want you to think as you read. What lesson does the main character learn? What lesson does the main character learn? Page 198. Mark pushed open the door and a bell jingled. Grandfather? He breathed deeply. Smells of polish, rosin, and glue filled the instrument shop as they always did. At a table in one corner, a short, bald man bent over a cello, rubbing a cloth in small circles over the smooth brown wood. Page 199. Mark! The man glanced up. Come in, come in. You have finished your lesson, I see. Yes, Mark sighed. My teacher gave me a new piece to learn from the school recital. Mark stood beside his grandfather watching. Grandfather turned to face him. Let me see your violin. Mark handed him the instrument. Grandfather turned the violin over in his hands, and his careful eyes studied it through his little round glasses. It needs polishing, he said. He pulled up 2 chairs and tossed Mark a cloth. Make it shine. The two worked quietly for a while. Mark listened to the whisking sounds of cloth on wood, sounds as soft as breathing. This takes a long time, doesn't it, Grandfather? Grandfather smiled. Polishing? He chuckled. Yes, polishing takes a fair amount of time, but clean wood gives a good sound. Always remember that. Mark nodded. He had heard his grandfather say those words many times. Page 200. This recital, when is it? Asked Grandfather. In 2 months, said Mark. Not long to learn a piece. No. You will have some polishing to do. Of another kind, said Grandfather. Mark thought of the little upstairs room with the window where he practiced, and his shoulders slumped. Every day after school he played his violin there for an hour. Sometimes his mother played the piano along with him, but even then the minutes crept by slowly. Grandfather, do you still practice every day? Grandfather did not answer just then. Instead, he lowered the cello gently to the floor between his knees. He picked up the bow, closed his eyes, and played a melody, a low and beautiful one that made Mark think of the wind sighing through the pines at night. I still play a little every day, the old man said finally. I cannot help it. Music has gotten into my heart, and if I didn't let the song come out somehow, my heart would burst. Page 201. He stood and placed the cello back on the table. Then he took off his glasses, wiped the back of his hand across his eyes, put the glasses on again, and bent to his polishing. How do you get music into your heart? Mark asked. He leaned forward eagerly. Grandfather chuckled again. It puts itself there, he said, as you polish. Mark frowned and went on rubbing his cloth over the wood of his violin, watching for the shine he knew would come. Page 202. Mark's friend Paul kicked the soccer ball to him. Can you stay a while longer? He asked. Some of the guys want to stay after soccer practice and play another game. Mark strung his soccer cleats over one shoulder and faced Paul. I can't, he said. Maybe next week, but not today. I've got to practice violin. But it'll only be for like an hour or so, said Paul. We need you to make a team. He bounced the ball off his knee. Mark looked out at the field where the boys were gathering. Then he looked across the street toward his house. What would it matter if he missed one day of violin practice? Then he thought of his grandfather and the melody he had played on the cello in his shop. I can't, Paul, he said. I have to learn my recital piece by heart. Okay, said Paul. That's what you want. He ran off toward the field. Mark's throat felt tight. He swallowed and turned quickly toward his house. In the quiet upstairs room, he took his violin out of its case. He stood in front of the window and began to play. From where he stood, he could see the other boys running and kicking the ball on the soccer field. Page 203. A noise behind him caused Mark to whirl around. Mother stood in the doorway. "Your grandfather, my father, always hated to practice," she said. Mark sat down on the piano bench and looked at the floor. "But grandfather loves to practice. Music is in his heart. He said so." Page 204. Mother smiled. "It hasn't always been that way. Not when he was a boy growing up in Poland. A family friend gave him the violin and taught him a little. But your grandfather was much more interested in the outdoors, working in the fields with his brothers and playing rough-and-tumble games. When he first came to America, jobs were hard to find. Before long, he realized that his violin was his only means of earning a living. So, with the little he knew, he played on street corners, in hotels, in parks, wherever he could find work." Mother sat down beside Mark. "The more your grandfather played because he had to, the more he realized that he wanted to. As time went by, music became so much a part of him that he wanted to work with it always. His dream was to be a concert violinist, but he had a family to feed by that time and no money for music training, so he opened his instrument shop. Sometimes people traded with him. He would repair their instruments and they would teach him. That's how he learned." Mother leaned forward and gave Mark's shoulder a soft squeeze. "Be thankful that you can have lessons." Mother left. Mark sat quietly thinking while the clock ticked. Then he stood, laid out his music on the stand, and picked up his violin again. Page 205. At last, the day of the recital came. That morning, Mark sat alone in his practice room and polished his violin. As he rubbed the cloth over the instrument, he remembered grandfather's words. "Clean wood gives a clean sound." Behind the stage of the school auditorium, Mark tuned his violin and played a few notes of his piece. Yes, it sounded clean. Mark walked into the stage, tucked his violin under his chin, and lifted the bow. The first notes eased their way into the air, clear and pure. Mark felt a smile curving up the corners of his mouth. He suddenly remembered grandfather's melody that had sounded like wind in the pines. He closed his eyes and played on by heart to the end. Page 206. As the last note died away, the audience began to clap. Mark bowed and looked out into the crowd. Someone at the back was standing, clapping hard. It was grandfather. Mark bowed again. His mouth felt stretched to its limit with smiling. Mother hurried to Mark after the recital. "Grandfather said to tell you he was sorry," she said. "He couldn't stay, but he wanted me to give you this." She handed Mark a recital program that listed each piece and the names of the students who had played. Beside Mark's name, grandfather had scribbled a note. "Dear Mark, somehow you have gotten music into your heart. Once it happens, it lasts forever. But remember, my boy, the way to keep shining is to keep polishing. And always remember, clean wood gives a clean sound. Grandfather." Page 207. Think and discuss. Number 1. Who is the main character and what lesson does he learn? Number 2. How is making a violin similar to learning to play a violin? And number 3. Look back at the chapter titles. Explain how these words have multiple meanings in the story. And number 4. What does Colossians 3:23 teach about the importance of working hard and doing your best? And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men. Colossians 3:23. And another question that I want to throw in for us to think about is, when grandfather says the way to keep shining is to keep polishing, what do you think that means? Could that be a metaphor for something else? Vocabulary to remember: audience, instrument, Rosen, auditorium, melody, tuned, cello, program, violin, concert, and recital.